They called her too wild to wed. But one cowboy would risk everything to prove that love isn't about taming a heart, it's about choosing it. Welcome, friends. Before we ride deeper into this tale, make sure to like this video, leave a comment about your favorite moment, and subscribe to Apache Love Stories, where every story blends grit, romance, and the untamed spirit of the Old West. Saddle up, because this is one you won't want to miss. The story begins in a land where the desert stretched wide as forever. The sun leaned heavy on the mesas, baking the earth until the dirt cracked and shimmered like glass. Heat waves rolled over the horizon. In the distance, a hawk circled, its shadow dragging across the plain like an omen. Dust clung to every breath, every bootstep, every horse's flank. Folks who survived here learned early, the desert never gave anything for free. And among those survivors was a man named Calder Wyatt. Calder wasn't much for words. His face was weathered by wind and regret, his eyes the color of smoke after a fire. Some men carried pistols to make themselves look dangerous. Calder carried silence, and that silence could cut deeper than any blade. He owned little more than his horse, a spread of tired land outside town, and a reputation that made folks step aside when he passed. Some said he was cursed, others swore he was blessed. Calder himself never claimed either, he just lived. But this day, as he rode into the heart of Dry Creek, fate waited for him. Not in the form of a card game or a bounty, but in the form of a woman. She stood at the edge of the square, her back straight as a pine, her gaze fixed like stone. An Apache woman, skin bronzed by the same sun that punished the desert. Hair braided tight, the end whipping in the wind. Eyes like the storm that builds at dusk, quiet but dangerous. The town watched her like a pack of coyotes circling something they didn't understand. Murmurs tangled in the air. She don't belong here. Wild thing. Savage blood. Yet she didn't flinch, didn't lower her eyes, didn't bow to their whispers. Calder noticed. He always noticed the ones who stood their ground when the world told them to kneel. Their gazes locked. His from the saddle, hers from the dust of the street. Walked toward the edge of town, dust rising with every step. Calder watched her go, watched until the crowd broke apart, until the murmurs died into mutters, until all that remained was the heat and the emptiness she left behind. Something had shifted. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't know why her presence made the whole town bristle. But he knew one thing. He'd see her again, and when he did, life in Dry Creek would never be the same. That night, the desert wind carried more than dust. It carried whispers, trouble brewing on the edge of Dry Creek. Calder Wyatt felt it in his bones. He had meant to ride home after trading salt and flour, but the voices pulled him toward the outskirts, where torchlight flickered against the dark. A knot of men had gathered near the hanging tree, their faces half-shadowed, their laughter cruel. And there she was, the Apache woman from the square, bound at the wrists, rope tight around her shoulders. A hand-painted sign swung from her neck. "White man don't forgive." Her braid was loose now, strands of black hair sticking to her face. Yet her gaze, steady as steel, didn't falter. Even surrounded by men who jeered, even with a rope threatening her freedom, she stood proud. Calder's jaw tightened. Dry Creek had a habit of eating its own, but this wasn't justice. This was spectacle. "Best to let it be, Wyatt," one of the men muttered when Calder edged his horse closer. "Ain't your fight. She's Apache. Stole a horse, maybe worse." But Calder saw the truth plain as daylight. No stolen saddle lay at her feet, no evidence, no proof. Just prejudice sharpened into rope. He swung down from the saddle, boots crunching in the dirt. The crowd shifted. Some knew Calder well enough not to block his path. Others scowled, muttering about his cursed silence. "You hang her," Calder said, voice low but carrying. "You'll have to hang me, too." A hush spread. No one laughed now. A man with a scar across his cheek spat in the dirt. "You planning to marry her then, Wyatt? Raise yourself a tribe of half-bloods?" The crowd chuckled nervously, trying to pull the fear out of their throats. Gratitude, but with curiosity, as if she couldn't decide whether this man was fool or ally. "You can walk free," Calder said quietly. Her wrists were raw where the rope had bitten. She rubbed them but never looked down, never showed weakness. "Freedom's just another rope," she answered, her voice low and edged with distrust. Calder studied her. He'd expected anger, he hadn't expected poetry. "You're safe for now," he said finally. She tilted her head, her braid sliding over one shoulder. "Safe?" She let the word linger in the dry air. Then she shook her head. "There's no safe here." With that, she stepped past him, barefoot on the dirt, and walked into the darkness beyond the torches. Calder stood watching until the shadows swallowed her whole. Something gnawed at him as he mounted his horse. He'd done what honor demanded, cut her free, sent the cowards scattering. But it didn't feel finished, not by a long shot. By dawn, Dry Creek was already buzzing. Word spread faster than wildfire. Calder Wyatt had cut an Apache woman free from the hanging tree. The saloon whispered it over whiskey. The mercantile murmured it between sacks of flour. By mid-morning, every ranch hand, every laundress, every preacher's wife had an opinion, and none of them were quiet about it. Calder ignored the talk as best he could. He'd never lived by another man's judgment, and he wasn't about to start. But when he found her again, sitting on the porch of the abandoned blacksmith shop at the edge of town, her arms folded like a shield, he knew ignoring her was impossible. "You hungry?" he asked, holding out a wrapped bundle of bread. Her eyes flicked to the bundle, then back to him. Food always has a price. Calder shifted his weight, his silence dragging out longer than most men could stomach. Finally, he set the bread beside her and turned to leave. "You're not going to eat it yourself?" she called after him. He stopped, glanced over his shoulder. "Already ate." Suspicion lingered in her eyes, but her stomach betrayed her. The faintest growl slipped into the morning air. With a reluctant sigh, she unwrapped the bread and tore into it. Calder breath. The Apache woman gave the faintest nod, as if she hadn't expected him to listen. But the town didn't forget. At the mercantile 2 days later, whispers turned sharp. Women pulled their children close when she passed. Men spat in the dust at Calder's boots. "Wyatt's gone soft," one rancher muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Ain't enough land for the likes of her. Next thing you know, she'll be cutting our throats in our sleep." Calder set his sack of beans on the counter, slow and deliberate. "You afraid of one woman, Jeb?" he asked, voice flat. The room went still. Jeb swallowed, his bluster fading under Calder's smoke-gray stare. The Apache woman said nothing, but when they left the store, her steps matched Calder's. Not side by side, not yet, but close enough the gossip couldn't wedge between them. That night, under the flicker of lamplight in his cabin, the tension sharpened again. "You think feeding me makes me tame?" she asked, standing by the window. Her shadow cut sharp against the log walls. Calder leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Don't need you tame." "Then why?" Her voice carried both challenge and a kind of weary confusion. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because a rope don't belong on a woman's neck. Not yours, not anybody's." The silence stretched, heavy as the desert night. At last, she turned from the window. "I don't need saving, cowboy." Calder's gaze didn't waver. "Good, 'cause I ain't trying to save you." Her lips pressed into a line, half a smirk, half a warning. She didn't trust him, not yet. But for the first time, she didn't look ready to run, and that was enough. The storm rolled in without warning. 1 minute the desert sky stretched wide and blue. The next it split open with sheets of rain and a wind that bent the mesquite flat. Calder was out mending fence when he saw her racing across the pasture, skirts plastered to her legs, hair whipping like black fire. She'd been gathering water from the spring when the clouds burst. "Barn!" Calder shouted over the thunder. He waved her in, already driving his cattle toward cover. She hesitated, pride stiffening her spine, but when lightning cracked close enough to rattle her bones, she sprinted after him. By the time they shoved the last heifer into himself with tools and tack, she sat on an overturned bucket, watching the rain slice the horizon through cracks in the boards. At last, she said, "You waste water." He looked up. "Beg your pardon? Your troughs, they leak." She gestured toward the corral. "Cattle drink less, lose strength. Weak cattle bring weak trade." Calder blinked. He hadn't noticed. "You see all that from a bucket?" She met his eyes, steady. "I was raised to see what feeds and what kills. You only see when it's too late." Her words might have been a barb, but Calder didn't bristle. He fixed his gaze on her and gave a slow nod. "Then maybe you'll keep me from making a fool of myself." Something softened in her expression, like a stone loosening from a wall. When the rain finally broke, the land glistened silver under a new moon. Together, they walked the fence line, checking damage. A sudden rattle froze them both. Snake. It coiled near Calder's boot, fangs flashing white in the moonlight. Before he could move, she stepped forward, whip fast, and brought her knife down clean. The rattler fell still, its sound dying with it. Calder let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "You always that quick?" She wiped the blade on her skirt. "You always that slow?" His laugh came easier this time, deep and genuine. Over the next days, necessity bound them tighter. She showed him how to read tracks near the spring, a sign of wolves too close for comfort. He taught her how to repair a saddle strap, her fingers clumsy at first, then steady. There were arguments, sharp as barbed wire. She accused him of wasting grain. He accused her of wandering too far from the ranch. Each clash sparked, but none burned them apart. Instead, sparks lit a fragile fire of understanding. One evening, while setting traps for the wolves, Calder handed her the hammer. "Your turn." She studied him, as if searching for the trick. But when she drove the stake deep into the earth, she caught his approving nod. For the first time, her mouth curved into something like a smile. Back at the cabin, with coyotes howling in the distance, Calder poured her a cup of coffee. She took it, hesitant, then drank. "Bitter," she said, grimacing, "like most things worth swallowing." Busy. She filled it with watchfulness, sitting near the fire but never too near, her eyes always measuring distance. But over time, silence shifted. It no longer felt like a fence, it felt like a bridge. One evening he found her outside, kneeling by the garden patch he'd struggled to keep alive. The moon lit her hair silver as she sifted the dry soil through her fingers. "Your earth is thirsty," she murmured. Calder leaned against the fence post. "So's every man in Dry Creek. We pray for rain, but it don't come easy." She looked up at him, dirt streaking her palms. "We don't pray, we listen." Her words carried weight, though Calder didn't yet understand them. Still, when she pressed a hand to the ground as if feeling its pulse, he didn't laugh. He found himself listening, too, not to the soil, but to her. The next day, she startled him by tending his cattle with quiet patience. She moved differently than he did, not driving the herd with force, but guiding them like a dance, gentle yet firm. The calves followed her without protest, as though they'd been waiting for her hand. "You've done this before," Calder said, watching. She shrugged. "Different animals, same hunger." That night, as the herd bedded down, Calder caught himself smiling. He hadn't smiled like that in years. One morning, he woke to the smell of cedar smoke and found her grinding corn with a stone he hadn't used in months. She'd built a small fire outside, humming under her breath in a language he didn't know. He sat down nearby, the warmth of the sun on his shoulders. "What's the song?" She hesitated, then said, "It's for beginnings." "For planting?" Her eyes flicked to his. "For trust." The words settled between them, heavier than any silence. The fire grew warmer that night. Calder sat across from her at the table, a chipped lamp between them. She reached for the bread he'd baked, clumsy, overcooked, and bit into it without complaint. "You cook like a soldier," she said dryly. He chuckled. "That bad?" Her lips curved, just barely. "That honest." The sound of her laughter, quiet, almost reluctant, lingered in his chest long after it faded. As days folded into weeks, a rhythm grew. He taught her to read, lingered, featherlight, as her eyes searched his face. "Who carried you from this wound?" she asked softly. Calder's throat tightened. "No one. I carried myself." For the first time, pity didn't darken her gaze. Instead, respect did. "Then you understand. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but in that simple touch, that shared scar, trust settled in. The kind that outlasts storms, the kind that whispers of something more." The piece they'd carved was fragile, like glass set out in a dust storm. Calder knew it, Ayanna knew it, and when trouble came, it shattered fast. It began with hoofbeats. Late one afternoon, Calder spotted dust rising along the ridge. Too many riders for neighbors, too steady for wanderers. Soldiers. He'd seen their kind before. Uniforms faded by sun, eyes hard with orders that never questioned themselves. Ayanna froze at the window, braid brushing her shoulder. "They're hunting me." Calder loaded his rifle with calm precision. "They won't take you." Her gaze searched his, torn between trust and fear. "You can't fight all of them." "No," he said quietly, "but I can fight long enough." The soldiers thundered into the yard, boots striking dust, rifles gleaming. Their leader, a captain with sharp eyes and a scar across his lip, dismounted slow, like a man certain of victory. "We're here for the Apache," he called. "Hand her over, Wyatt. She's wanted for raiding camps, killing settlers." Ayanna stiffened. Calder stepped forward, rifle in hand. "She killed no one, and she ain't leaving here." The captain's smirk curled. "You gonna make yourself an enemy of the U.S. Army for her? For a savage?" Calder's silence was answer enough. The standoff crackled like lightning waiting to strike. The soldiers fanned out, hands near triggers. Ayanna's breath came fast behind him, though her face showed no fear. Then the betrayal came. Not from Calder, not from Ayanna, from the town. Scarface, the same man who'd once tried to string her up, rode in with two others, faces ugly with spite. "Told you he'd be hiding her," Scarface crowed. Man's lost his wits over an Indian girl. Calder's stomach turned. Neighbors he'd traded cattle with, drunk whiskey beside, now turning him in like he was an outlaw. "Run." She grabbed his spare rifle, snapping it open with practiced hands. In the hail of bullets, she returned fire, her eyes fierce and steady. They fought back to back, strangers no more, the desert swallowing the thunder of their defiance. Still, numbers weighed heavy. Calder felt the burn of a bullet slice across his arm, another grazing his ribs. Blood slicked his shirt, slowing him. Ayanna saw. She grabbed his hand, tugging hard. "The river!" Together they broke through the line, running for the scrub and the canyon beyond. Shots followed, ricocheting off stone, whistling past their ears. Calder stumbled once, nearly falling, but Ayanna pulled him on, her strength surprising even him. They didn't stop until the roar of the river swallowed the sound of pursuit. Under the cover of rocks, Calder dropped to his knees, chest heaving, blood soaking his shirt. Ayanna knelt beside him, her hands steady despite the fire in her eyes. "You're hurt." He forced a grin through the pain. "I've been worse." She pressed cloth against the wound, her touch firm but gentle. For the first time, her mask cracked, fear flashing raw in her gaze. "Don't leave me now," she whispered. Calder met her eyes, his breath ragged, not planning on it. Behind them, the soldiers' shouts grew faint. Ahead, the river rushed wild and untamed, the same way their lives would have to be from this moment on. Together, they had chosen, and there was no turning back. The desert night swallowed them whole. The river roared at their backs, masking the soldiers' fading shouts, but Calder knew they weren't safe. Men like that didn't quit until they had blood to show for their trouble. He staggered as they climbed the canyon path, his hand pressed to the wound along his ribs. Each breath burned, every step heavier than the last. Ayanna walked ahead, sure-footed in the dark, then circled back to steady him when he faltered. "Leave me," Calder rasped. She turned on him, fierce as lightning. "You carried yourself before, but not now, not with me." Her words snapped like a whip, and for once Calder didn't argue. By dawn, they reached a small cave tucked beneath the canyon wall. Ayana coaxed a fire to life, a light in her gaze that hadn't been there before. The hours dragged, each one heavier than the last. Outside, crows circled, shadows against the blazing sky. Calder dozed in fits, pain pulling him under, dragging him back again. Ayana never left his side. When night fell, she rose. "I must draw them away," she said. Calder tried to push himself up. "No." She pressed him down with surprising strength. "You stay. Heal. I know this land better than they do. If I run, they will follow." His chest tightened with fear sharper than the bullet wound. "They'll kill you." She leaned close, her braid brushing his cheek, her voice steady. "They'll try, but I am not so easy to hang." He caught her hand, gripping it tight despite his weakness. "Ayana," her name lingered on his lips, the first time he'd spoken it aloud. It rooted her in place, her breath trembling. "You've carried enough alone," he said. "Don't carry this too." In the silence that followed, something passed between them, heavier than duty, lighter than hope, truer than either had dared admit. She bent her forehead to his, the firelight flickering around them. "Then we fight together." Before dawn, the soldiers found the canyon trail. Gunshots cracked, echoing against stone. Ayana steadied Calder to his feet, his rifle in his hands, her knife in hers. Side by side, they faced the oncoming storm. Bullets sparked against the rocks, shouts rising as the soldiers advanced. Calder fired, each shot measured, each breath costing him. Ayana moved swift and sure, striking from shadow, her cry fierce as the desert wind. They fought not for survival alone, but for each other. When at last the soldiers broke and fled, leaving their wounded behind, Calder sagged against the cave wall, vision blurring. Ayana caught him, arms strong despite her trembling. "You see?" she whispered, pressing her cheek to his. "Together." He smiled faintly, his blood warm against her skin. "Together," he echoed. The desert lay quiet again, but nothing was the same. They had stood against death, side by side, and in that crucible, their bond had been sealed. Not in vows, not in words, but in sacrifice. The canyon was quiet after the gunfire faded, too quiet. Only the rush of the river remained stubborn as desert stone. Ayana kept him moving, kept him breathing, kept him laughing even when the pain cut deep. When his strength returned enough to ride, they left the canyon behind. Not back to the ranch. That place was marked now, haunted by betrayal. Instead, they followed the river south, chasing greener land where no soldiers came, no townsfolk judged, no rope swung from a tree. They found it one evening, a bend in the river where cottonwoods leaned wide and the soil smelled rich. Calder sat in the saddle, staring at the place, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Ayana saw it too. "This ground listens," she said softly, kneeling to press her palm to the earth. "It will feed us." The cabin they built was rough at first, logs dragged from the riverbank, stones stacked by hand. Calder's muscles ached, Ayana's palms blistered, but together they raised walls strong enough to keep out the wind, a roof that held against the rain. At night, they lay by the fire, trading stories like lifelines. Calder spoke of his sister, the one he hadn't been able to save. Ayana spoke of her family, the camp burned by soldiers, the songs she carried like embers. Neither asked forgiveness of the other. Instead, they found it in the act of listening. One evening, as spring painted the riverbanks green, Calder carved something into the new gatepost. Ayana came to stand beside him, curious. The letters were rough but clear. For Ayana, for life. Her hand brushed the wood, her throat tight. "You would give your land my name." Calder shook his head. "Not just the land. My days, my nights, what's left of me." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned against him, her hand finding his. "Then we share them, all of them." Seasons turned. Grass grew thick along the river, the cattle thrived. Ayana tended a small garden, her songs weaving life into the rows of corn and beans. Calder watched her sometimes, her laughter mingling with the wind. and thought no church in Dry Creek could hold the kind of grace he'd found here. When winter came, they faced it together, splitting wood, mending fences, warming their nights with more than fire. By spring, a new life stirred within Ayana, small and steady as the river's current. Calder West cabin stood against the horizon like a lone sentinel, smoke curling from its chimney, the faint crackle of firewood marking the slow rhythm of survival. Calder sat near the hearth, his hand bandaged, his body worn from battles seen and unseen. Across from him, Ayana moved with a softness that was never weakness, her hair falling loose over her shoulders, her eyes catching the firelight with that unshakable defiance he had fallen in love with. On the small table between them sat a worn leather journal. Calder had carried it for years, scribbling thoughts he never dared to speak aloud. It was a place for confessions the world would never hear, dreams, regrets, the ghost of his sister's memory. Tonight, for the first time, he slid it toward her. "Write in it," he whispered, "so it won't just be my story anymore. It'll be ours." Ayana hesitated, her fingers brushing the journal like it might vanish. Then, slowly, she dipped the pen and began to write. The firelight glowed against the page as her hand moved in careful, deliberate strokes. Calder watched, breath caught in his chest, as she wrote the words in her language first, then repeated them in his. Not taken, not tamed, chosen. When she finished, she closed the journal and pressed her hand over it, sealing the vow. Calder reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers, and for a long moment neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence carried its own sacred weight, heavier and truer than any sermon or preacher's blessing. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. The horizon was painted in the dying colors of sunset, streaks of red and gold bleeding into the dark. Calder thought of every mile of desert, every canyon, every grave and scar and promise that had brought them here. And in that moment, he knew. This was no ending. This was the beginning of a life not bound by chains, laws, or vengeance, only by choice. Ayana leaned closer, her lips brushing his ear in a whisper meant only for him. "You are not my captor, Calder Wyatt. You are my home." He closed his eyes at the words, his hand tightening over hers. The journal, the fire, the vows, they weren't ceremonies written in a reminder of what love looks like when it's forged in fire, when it refuses to bow to fear, when it lives wild and free. Here at Apache Love Stories, we bring you these untold romances of the Old West, tales of forbidden love, of courage, of women and men who chose one another in the face of impossible odds. If this story touched you, if you felt the heartbeat of Calder and Ayana's journey, then help us keep that fire alive. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Every story is a trail worth following, and your voice is what keeps the ride going. Until the next campfire tale, remember, love is not about taming. Love is about choosing.